Hello, this is Joe Procaccino. I'm going to be following up a presentation by my colleague, Professor Giordano, speaking about legal and ethical issues in DoD public and occupational health matters. Let me go ahead and just first quickly eliminate any claims that I may be receiving tens of millions of dollars from this presentation as a government employee. I am not, so let's go ahead and get right into the meat of the conversation here this morning. I'm going to try to avoid being overly redundant from some of the very philosophical points presented earlier by my colleague, but I want to try to reduce this into kind of real world considerations and situations that you may or are facing regarding issues with public and occupational health. And you can see from my own particular bias perspective as an attorney, and having experience looking at these kinds of things, what are the roles of public health? It would include, obviously, as you can see in the litany over here, preventing epidemics, protecting environmental hazards, avoiding injury, promoting encouraging behaviors, things that obviously all of you know. Research and education on the bottom are particularly important. From a lawyer's perspective, you can see that there are a veritable plethora of areas where we get our public health and occupational health laws from. But notice that under authority to act, again, my favorite language, salus populi suprema lex esto, means essentially the health of the people is the supreme law. And so the idea here is that we're trying to protect the public at large. Now, I mention these types of laws and legislations because these end up becoming the source of a lot of consternation and conflict, as we've seen with the experience of dealing with COVID over the past year and a half. But you can see that public health derives much of its power directly from the Constitution, as far as the police power and promoting the general welfare, as well as the Commerce Clause. And Commerce Clause essentially means that anything that crosses a state line may be subject to some kind of federal control or protection. And virtually everything we do today in one form or another ends up crossing from one state into another. So you're going to see federal involvement in lots of different things. The problem here, of course, as we've noticed, is that quite often what the federal government would like to do may often be in conflict with what states want to have done. And this creates a difficulty as far as acting in a unified fashion. When we talk about areas of public health, there are some that immediately come to mind to the average layperson, of course. And we've seen this with experience dealing with public health in our services over the past decades. These have been efforts to try to reduce and eliminate smoking by our active duty and even beneficiary members. By doing all sorts of things as far as restricting smoking in most buildings or on an installation, trying to encourage through education the reduced use of tobacco products. We also see the importance of inspections, things we quite often take for granted. When you go to the local PX or BX or NEX, you see barbershops and you see hair salons. And when you look at these kinds of things, who's really regulating these? Who's performing public health checks to make sure that the equipment that is being used by these individuals is actually clean, actually meets public health guidelines? And during the issue of COVID, what was done to help enhance the cleanliness of these areas to prevent the spread of any kind of bacteria or virus or disease to individuals, things that would be used over and over again, for instance, like a cloth that would be put over the person's body during hair cutting. Suddenly it becomes a throwaway, one-use only type of thing to help, again, enhance these sterilization issues and prevent any kind of disease. We also look at animal testing, even on base, to make sure that we're not dealing with any kind of rabid animals that could cause problems with people that are living or working on the installation. We're dealing with issues involving vendors as far as daycare is concerned, making sure the children are protected. In regard to this, how about the swimming pools that are on the installations, not to mention the playgrounds? Are these safe? Are they meeting certain guidelines that have been set up? Are they adequately clean? Are they adequately maintained? And this, again, falls under the area of public health, but things we take for granted. Obviously, with disease prevention, one of the big ones, as we're seeing right now, is the issue of immunization. But this also leads to more controversial areas that we've seen in the civilian environment, particularly those states or local jurisdictions that are practicing needle exchange. And here's a good example of where public health is in a balancing test that Professor Giordano alluded to, where you're trying to prevent the spread of a particular disease. But in order to prevent that higher good, if you will, the utilitarian good, what we end up doing is essentially distributing clean needles so people can continue to take illicit drugs. So one might argue, is this the appropriate thing to do, or is the higher good of avoiding disease worthy then of allowing such a needle exchange to take place? We also have to deal with fitness and diet, and this becomes important too. But again, how do we regulate this as far as going so far that you start banning products, say, inside a commissary, so people that might be able to purchase it on the outside suddenly are not able to purchase that product on the inside of the installation? Is there a fairness there? This also came up as far as the issue even of tobacco products, if you will, or perhaps the Class 6 store with alcohol. These are the kind of things that actually promote someone's health and welfare, but yet do you want to deny these, particularly if they're deemed legal? And most recently, we get into the area of genetics and genomics right now, something relatively new that Professor Giordano talked about with the advance of technology. And whether this is being done passively or even actively, how does the work with genomics affect the public health? Very, very important considerations that we have to look at. Now, Professor Giordano noted this equipoise that we're trying to talk about in balancing the role of a healthcare provider in public health. And you'll notice that from the more simplistic lawyer's perspective, I would suggest to you that with standard healthcare, clinical healthcare, the patient is the individual being evaluated and treated. And this is the primary purpose of the role of the provider in this situation. However, I note and read over here, the realism is that with public health care, the patient is the public as a whole being evaluated and treated. And here's where the mix comes in here, sometimes to the detriment of the individual, but again, utilitarianistically, for the greater good of the entire population. Now, it's important to understand that while you try to make everybody happy, when you're dealing with public health, as we've seen over the past 15 or 16 months, you can't please everyone. But the role of the public health officer or public health provider is not necessarily to please every individual. You simply can't do that. You're trying to please individuals by treating and pleasing the whole. And if you can make the whole better or keep the whole better, then the presumption would be that the individual, by being made better, also benefits from this. But it doesn't always play out day by day, as we've seen. So then, from an ethical standpoint, it would seem to me that the public health provider is constantly in a juggling act, if you will, even more so than a balancing act, because here what you're juggling day by day is the autonomy of the individual here, whether it's a patient or just a member of the public. You're also balancing or juggling that with the concept of beneficence, to make or to do well, which is obviously your role, to make people better and to keep them better. Non-maleficence, as Professor Giordano points out, trying not to do harm to any individual. This important ethical concept of justice, treating people equally, the equitable distribution of care, which of course has been argued in the public right now over the past year and a half as being a very controversial point. And finally, in this situation, all of these have to be mixed together with, under DOD, the mission of the military, the mission to try to keep our troops battle ready. And in doing so, are there injustices? Are there lacks of equity? Are there triages here that may be necessary to enhance the mission or enhance the availability of troops to be able to fight. All of these things are somewhat unique inside a DoD environment, but extremely important in understanding how we kind of distribute care in a public health situation. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of my conversation that we're talking about public and occupational health. And quite often, occupational health gets left behind in the discussion. And when we talk about this, it would seem to me that we need to consider certain particular ethical issues for those of you that are or could be involved in occupational health. Now, here, just as with public health, the first question it comes up with is, who does the provider actually work for? And in a public health environment, we've already suggested that you're working for the public as a whole. But here, it may be that your patient is not necessarily the individual that you're examining, but the employer that you are working for. It could be the military, DoD. It could be an insurance company on the outside. But again, the nature or the purpose of this kind of care is not necessarily clinical treatment or examination for the individual's benefit, but is to assess them as far as their ability to be able to accomplish an employment type of task. And if that's the case, then what is your role? And if so, does it create conflicts of interest? Imagine, if you will, looking as an occupational health provider for DoD, someone that comes into you to be screened, and you discover that they have epilepsy. You also discover that they're a pilot. Now, this may be inconsistent with someone that has epilepsy. Now, in a normal situation, you may have an obligation of confidentiality to that person's medical record or medical information. But because this is an occupational examination, is there an overriding duty or interest of you to report that to an individual that you work for that may abrogate what the patient here, if you will, thinks is something that should be kept confidential? And we see this pop up all over the place, even in the civilian world, with doctors that are examining people involving driver's licenses, whether it be for business or even for personal use. But it does present a conflict. You also have the issue of autonomy versus informed consent of the employees. And what I mean by this is that for occupational health considerations, when someone is hired on to perform a certain task, are they being informed by the proper people as to the potential dangers or hazards that may be part of their occupation? In other words, are they going to be working with toxic chemicals or working in an environment where there's radiation? And if so, what kind of protections are being afforded for those people? What kind of physicals are being given? So if these people are predisposed to have problems related to toxicity, that they be informed about this, or perhaps not be pushed into a situation where it could actually harm their health. To what degree is that being passed on to the potential employee? We also talk about limiting the limits of support of work that may be dangerous to employees. If we end up knowing that there are problems with toxicity, then what do we have in place to be able to protect these people? What kind of PPE do we have, for instance, when we're dealing with a COVID-like situation? Or if you do have them working in a chemical environment over here, to make sure they're properly gowned up. Imagine those people working, say, with anthrax years ago, to make sure that they were adequately gowned up so nothing could actually touch their skin. All of these things are very, very important. And this enters the world of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And we all know that OSHA, part of the Department of Labor, was created in part to be able to oversee and make sure that there were adequate safety measures for employees. Now, what's very interesting, however, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is that there is an exemption for OSHA's involvement, and that is with the military. Now, it's interesting that it's kind of bifurcated, that there's been a determination made that in DoD and in the services, if there is any kind of work that's involved that is not necessarily a uniquely military type of thing being done, then OSHA would have some involvement and their regulations may have some control in that situation. But if the work that is being done is deemed to be of a military nature, a uniquely military nature, then the military is exempted from OSHA regulations. Now, does this create a potential problem as far as non-maleficence, as far as justice, making sure people, again, get the same kind of protections that they would if OSHA was actually covering those individuals? Now, one would say that DOD has over the years, and there is separate legislation, which certainly gives the military an obligation to at least show that they're keeping up with the same kinds of regulations that OSHA would have to protect those individuals. But it is interesting that the military was exempted from OSHA per se. You also have issues involving the degree and expertise of providers. Quite often, particularly in smaller installations, you find that providers end up being assigned as the occupational health provider where they really have no specialization in this particular area. And they may miss something during an examination because of that lack of expertise. Does that then affect standard of care? Does that then affect the degree of beneficence being afforded someone if that provider cannot honestly be able to deliver the best type of care for that person? We also see justice issues come up with injury assessments in occupational care. If someone is injured on the job, they may be entitled to workman's compensation. And in the federal environment, if you're a civilian employee under FECA, and under those situations, you will be able to get some kind of benefit for any kind of loss or injury you have from the Department of Labor. However, those benefits that you may get may be limited to some extent because they will not pay for any kind of pain and suffering. And you may be precluded from filing a legal action because you were an employee and were already getting a benefit. It's somewhat similar to the prior arguments, and in many cases today still an argument for those people that are covered under the Ferries Doctrine, where an active duty military member may be injured, but because they are active duty and it is not a medical malpractice type of situation, right now the law would still say that they are precluded from taking any kind of action to get recompense other than the benefits that are afforded by their fact that they're an active duty member and can get free medical, dental, and other types of care for the problems that they've had. We also have issues involving health-challenged employees and protections. And here, when we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Rehabilitation Act of 1983, which really applies to federal work within DOD, how are those people being handled within the occupational environment? Are there reasonable accommodations that are being made? And even here, we see recent challenges as far as, say, the use of service animals and how far you can go with that, not only in an environment of normal employment, but how about in a healthcare environment? All of these things suddenly have to be balanced between the rights of an individual versus the overall right of the larger population. We further have issues involving confidentiality. And with confidentiality, we have a potential effect of HIPAA here because, again, for occupational care, this is not necessarily clinical care. And the law in most situations will say that occupational health care records are not subject to the protections of HIPAA. Now, there may be some overlap if those medical records, particularly electronic medical records, have a dual use. But if those records are being kept primarily or entirely for purposes of occupation, then HIPAA protections would not apply. And then even genomics or genetic testing, that normally we have a federal law, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is abbreviated GINA, that protects people's genetic testing results from being exposed to the public or other entities. There's a right of confidentiality of this information. However, again, just like mentioned above, one exemption here under that law is for active duty members of the military. So again, we have this ethical question of justice because of the mission issue here that's affected and whether or not We can get genetic information from a military member, and if the genetic information shows that they may not be fit to be deployed, then that may be an overriding concern over and above their individual right of privacy. Again, all of these kind of crossover between law and ethics. Now, if we go back and look at a more general issue and list of considerations for both occupational and public health, I'd suggest the following are ones that really should be in the back of your medulla oblongata here before any kinds of decisions are made. First, the quandaries that occur. When we're dealing with public health matters, are you taking into account the cultural diversity of the population in which you are working? And we've seen many, many problems here because of cultural differences, not only within the various states and regions of our country, but also within certain sub-areas. For instance, the Native American population, the indigenous population. How are we treating those individuals? And not only that, but as an example, there may be certain cultures that where informed consent is normally done with an individual before any kind of care or examination is made. There are some cultures where you must look to the chiefs of a tribe, for instance, to get the consent of that group of individuals before you can actually touch a member of that particular that cult or tribe, if you will. Now, you also have issues involving religion and conscience, as we've seen with COVID here, where people may feel that you're restricting them from being able to attend a religious observance is anathema to their First Amendment right of freedom of religion. The issue of working with someone in a public health environment where you're being asked to do something that violates your own personal feelings or your own conscience on how you handle somebody becomes a potentially ethical issue too. And this must be weighed in the balance. Do you still want to continue working in an environment where you cannot honestly say to yourself that you are able to afford the appropriate care under common standards of care because of your own conscience and beliefs? You also have economic considerations. And this goes back to the diversity that Professor Giordano talked about, as well as the next one, social, because these implicate the problems of dealing with minority populations. And when you're dealing with them, the question of justice, for instance, the availability of vaccines to get into those kind of environments, become very, very important here. The ability of people to be able to afford care, to afford education becomes extremely critical here, and then ends up showing a disparity in the justice or equity of being able to give appropriate care. Again, we go back to the issue of technology and genomics. It's interesting as an example that now, through the wonders of technology, we can take someone's genetic propensities and then look at the environment and see whether or not, as an example, someone's genes may make them predisposed to certain disease processes or even environmental issues which could cause illness in that person. And say for an active duty member, this is a beneficial type of thing because we can say, well, if Joe Procaccino has this particular genetic propensity in, say, a desert environment, we don't want to send him there because he would not be effective there. He would probably get ill. We'll send someone else and we'll save him for a different kind of environment. These, again, can be used in a public health type of scenario as well. But this technology then interferes, we said earlier, with the issue of privacy, particularly when we're dealing with genomics. And how far do you go with manipulating someone's genetics to be able to achieve what you believe is a higher good, but what they believe is really an adverse effect on their own autonomous integrity of their body and their own genetic makeup? It's interesting that there are many people who would like to try to create the perfect person so we wouldn't have any public health issues. But I believe it might have been Socrates thousands of years ago that once said that if everything were beautiful, there'd be no beauty, because what do you have to compare it to? We need variation in humanity, even if that amounts to some people having more medical issues than others, because that diversity allows really for the advancement really of humanity. Constitutional conflicts that we've mentioned earlier, for instance, your right of religion versus the constitutional right under the police powers of public health to be able to protect under the overall good, or someone who wants to give a child a vaccine inside a school to protect the rest of the class, and whether or not that child has a constitutional right to refuse that vaccine, whether it be based on religion or simply autonomous right as reflected through the parents. And what about the influence of the media? And we've seen this particularly in the area of COVID right now. And I'm always reminded of my grandmother's wisdom, where she would say in Italian, "Si vuoi sognare male, va a letto col giornale," which translates, if you want to have nightmares, go to bed with a newspaper. And I mention this to you because we live in an environment right now where really kind of scared journalism has become the mode of the day. And when you turn on the television to watch the news, even on your regular channels, usually there's some very dramatic music that starts out before the news begins. And all of the news that's presented is presented in a very, very kind of dramatic fashion to keep you watching constantly. And the reason why I bring this up to you is that one begins to wonder then if it has an adverse effect on the population as a whole, particularly in the public health world. When you look at COVID and you see all the various back and forth progress, not progress, is this correct, is this not correct, it boggles the imagination. Someone once said recently, and I thought it was very well said, that in the United States, it's not that difficult to scare somebody, but it is very difficult to unscare them. And when you make a statement, particularly in the media, if something does change, then if you try to reflect that, it's very difficult to get people who are scared to suddenly come back from that, to feel more comfortable. So how you present something initially is incredibly important as to how it's going to be received, and equally important how it's going to be retained by those people who's, as far as vaccines, as far as the appropriateness of how close they get to someone else, et cetera, et cetera. We go back to our main list over here. We talk about racial issues. And again, the disparity within racial populations of being able to get public health benefits to them is a real issue. And we're still trying to confront that right now, not to mention the problems that we saw through experiments, whether it be the Tuskegee experiments or others, where it causes a real concern on the part of people. Are you singling us out to become essentially guinea pigs, or allowing us to be used as a source really of lesser beneficial remedies? This came up, for instance, since we have 3 kinds of vaccines. If there's a vaccine that may be more efficacious than another one, but another vaccine which is not as efficacious, more widely available, and therefore, or maybe cheaper, and we can use those in a population that may not have the economics or the background to understand the difference. Is that being fair? Why aren't they getting the same kind of benefit as other people are? We have issues involving language and linguistics, and this becomes a problem in and of itself too. You know, as an example, it's we got to be very careful when you're speaking to people in a public health environment that have differences in languages, not only because they speak a different language, but there may be a variation or a dialect of that language in which they don't understand what you're trying to say. A quick example would be the Italian word to be embarrassed is imbazzare, but the Spanish word embarazar means to become pregnant. Now, obviously, they're 2 totally different things, even though they sound the same. And I mention this to you because a lot of people in public health right now, particularly with COVID and working on the border in the South, are using translations and putting them on signs and documents that come directly out of Google Translate. Google Translate is a wonderful tool, but the concern is that the Google Translate type of language may not necessarily reflect the unique dialect or even language variants of certain people coming, say, from Central America. And you've got to be very careful to make sure that people truly understand exactly what is being said, because health is extremely important, and you want to be able to pinpoint exactly what the problem is and explain it in a way that they can truly understand. Age obviously becomes an issue here too in the distribution of justice. If someone is young, then we see right now with children. Obviously, we want to make sure they're protected as far as the vaccine is concerned. But are we giving them adequate protection right now inside the schools? And you see the problem right now with some parents still advocating that the child remain with a mask on and others not remain with a mask on. And I would have to say that the public health community, as far as the federal portion is concerned, particularly the Centers for Disease Control, seems quite often to be coming out with information that changes or modifies almost day to day, causing confusion with a lot of people as to what the right thing to do or not to do is right now. And we see that in the media right as we speak. Medical and physical conditions of individuals are very important too, because when you're trying to distribute public health type of care, that may actually be adverse in some respects to someone, say, who's immunosuppressive, and whether or not they can benefit from the same kind of care that is being given to the overall population. Is that minority of the population being taken into consideration? You've got the dual loyalties issue, as I mentioned earlier, in balancing when you're in the military, your military mission with trying to protect the health of individuals. Does the mission become more important than the care of one person, if you will? And we see that play out not only during wartime, but we see that in national disasters as we've experienced right now. And one of the issues that came up in this regard would be as far as vaccines being given out. Should there have been or should there be higher priority for active duty or for active duty that are about to be deployed because we want to make them mission ready? Should that be a higher goal to the detriment of other people that may actually have physical issues that require the vaccine be given as soon as possible? We also see jurisdictional disparities. We see battles between the federal versus the state, between one state versus another state. When you cross state line, there may be one state that still mandates the use of masks, another state saying, throw the masks away. And you begin to wonder then, going back to the culture of that particular community, what is right and what is wrong? Why is it okay in one state and not another state? And this becomes a challenge in our country because if you think about it from your high school and even elementary school days, the United States is really a nation of nations. We're 50 plus jurisdictions, each of which having their own laws, and they are allowed to under the U.S. Constitution. And because of that, you're going to see this disparity. And when you deal with public health, particularly in an environment where people are constantly crossing over from one state to another, driving to visit family or participating in business, why is it that we can't have a sense of consistency in the way that public health is being distributed? We have triage for care and vaccines. And when I mention this here, I mention U.S. and global concerns. There is a debate, and there has been a debate, as to the degree of which the United States should go to make sure that vaccines, for instance, that we have are available to the world community, because we are part of the world. And there is so much commerce and there's so much international travel that for us to neglect other nations as far as being able to give them assistance causes problems with our own country eventually. But there's another argument that's been used, and the analogy that's sometimes been given is the one that's used when you take a flight on an airplane, that you'll notice that when the flight attendant goes through all of the rules and regulations prior to the takeoff, one of them is going to be that if the oxygen mask dropped from the top of the plane, who is the first person that's supposed to get the mask? You as the adult, and then you use it until you are able to be stabilized, and then you pass it along, say, to your child or someone else that may not be able to hold it or use it the same way an adult can use it. And if you think of that analogy, the argument then becomes that maybe we should make ourselves in the United States better first, and then be able to distribute that other justice, if you will, or vaccines to other countries. Because for us to have only a 40 or 50% efficacy rate and suddenly start shipping all the vaccines around the world may not necessarily solve the problems here. So what is the right answer? What is the balance that we have to face? And that justice issue pops up yet once again. I can't help but mention misrepresentation and panic in this discussion, because it does raise a question here as to truth-telling. and the issue of trust, particularly of public health providers. If you know that there is a disease, if you know that there is a public health danger that could really cause massive problems in the community eventually, but you haven't been able to confirm things yet, do you go public and tell them of your concerns, or do you want to try to avoid panic until you have more information? And by failing to tell people the exact truth of where things stand right now or what you know thus far, are you misrepresenting the truth? If someone asks you a specific question, is COVID-19 a potential problem for our country? And you say, no, we don't think it is at this point. Is it a lie? Is it skewing the truth? Or if the reason why you skewed the truth was to avoid a panic, particularly in buying toilet paper or buying PPE equipment, which could then be better used by healthcare providers. Once again, is there a higher utilitarian good in misrepresenting or skewing the facts for a higher public health consideration? Tough call to make sometimes. We see this with propaganda during war, where countries will end up not broadcasting the absolute truth, say, of losses that were suffered by troops because you don't want to give the enemy that advantage of knowing that there's a problem. Is there an analogy in a public health environment? The issue of confidentiality. And once again, this becomes a major problem because while there's a normal expectation on a patient of confidentiality, you may have an overriding concern here to report this. Imagine, say, for instance, sexually transmitted diseases. This is why states in most jurisdictions have laws that would say that if there are certain diseases which are on a list of identified public health kinds of problems, that a public health entity should be informed that an individual patient has that particular disease, and then that information is sent to public health, and it becomes the responsibility of the public health officials to track down the contacts of that individual. Supposing, in a given circumstance, one of the potential contacts of an individual is the spouse of the individual that does not know that the other spouse has a particular disease. And to make it even more complicated, that particular other spouse does not want the other spouse to know that they have that particular disease. What's more important, maintaining the confidentiality of the individual or preventing the spread of disease? It becomes a utilitarian issue and goes back to the slide that I had mentioned earlier, where the role of public health is protecting the public, even sometimes to the potential detriment of the preferences of the individual. And finally here, I note the issue of research. And there are going to be separate discussions and conversations from other speakers regarding research ethics. But I want to bring this up to you very, very briefly, because you will see the question becomes here, what is truth? And when we deal with trust, this comes out as far as our research is concerned too. What is truth, and how do we exhibit this? How do we maintain the trust of the public? And when we see this also, we notice that with human research and clinical investigation regulations, there are numerous federal and DoD regulations which cover investigations that are done. I mention investigations here because we've seen an incredible degree of research done in order to be able to develop vaccines for COVID. And we've seen similar efforts in the past, whether it was SARS, whether it was the Zika virus, all of these things to try to find something quickly to be able to stem the problem that was created. But in looking at these, you have to look at, for instance, at competency and cultural issues, as I mentioned before. Is the person able to understand, if they're the subject of research, what is being done to them? Also, are there special considerations for vulnerable populations? What about children? What about pregnant women? What about prisoners that are being used? What about service members? And the issue of even using feti or fetuses inside research that are being done for public health purposes. I mentioned service members here as an example because there were some discussions about challenge investigations where you would have active duty service members volunteer to take an active virus and then see whether or not the vaccine would be efficacious against the virus. One of the concerns that was expressed with people that would normally volunteer for this would be, if you're active duty, there is that kind of argument that, can you truly say that you are fully volunteering, or are you being volunteered, particularly if you're of a lower grade or rank in the military, and you don't want to end up becoming not a team player with the rest of the people in your unit, or you don't want to end up embarrassing yourself or making yourself less qualified in the eyes of your superiors. So it may force you to volunteer to something you otherwise might not normally do. And it presents an optics problem then, as far as whether or not it's appropriate to end up using someone in that type of situation. All of these things need to be considered in the mix. And that goes back to this point of using active duty as subjects. Because of the optics and voluntariness, the equitable distribution of subjects also requires justice here too, making sure that if you're going to use any kind of research or experiment, that is done equitably and not just for a certain element of the population, that some people benefit to the detriment of others. And considerations for sensitive studies. If you're doing public health surveys, for instance, and let's use as an example suicide, and you end up talking to someone and you give them a list of questions, but you haven't given them informed consent, or at least information to obtain an informed consent. How do you know, for instance, that that person had not attempted suicide, or someone in their family had committed suicide? Or if it's, say, sexual assault, if maybe that person had had a sexual assault committed against them in their past, and merely seeing this question makes them relive that particular incident and only exacerbates the psychological damage that was done. These are things that you really have to consider before simply going out and even what you think may be simply asking questions in order to achieve a higher public health purpose. All of this affects the beneficence of the care being given to an individual. And then, as mentioned earlier, alluded to earlier, terminology and length of informed consent. Keep it simple when you talk to people that you're working with. Don't presume that they can use polysyllabic terminology that most of you as providers use commonly as you walk down the wards of a hospital or speak to each other. Very, very important. So the takeaway from a simple lawyer's perspective here, as far as public and occupational health practice, would be, when you're acting with a sense of objectivity. Because when you act with a sense of objectivity, it indicates a sense of fairness. Fairness indicates equity. Equity indicates trying to practice with a sense of justice. Balance your roles. It's important to remember that that individual does have certain expectations as far as care is concerned. And when you're practicing public health, even though your patient may be the public, don't simply dismiss the individual's needs, but see how that works into the higher good of protecting the public. The importance of communication with the public, with patients, with other healthcare providers, with politicians and other community people, to make sure everyone understands, even the media, making sure they can give as much of an objective presentation as it's ever possible coming from the media. And then obviously performing with quality. Quality implies making sure that you're performing to the best of your ability. And if you cannot perform that to the best of your ability, make it clear to your supervisors that you don't feel comfortable with that kind of performance. And finally, and to me, probably most importantly, the idea of respect and integrity for the public and for the people that you're working with, because they're looking to you for trust. As Professor Giordano said, they're looking to you for an answer to something that's affecting not only economically, socially, as far as their families are concerned, but also their health and welfare. If you can try to do these, then maybe at least from an ethical standpoint, as well as a legal standpoint, we can reach some kind of success in promoting public health. Thank you for your patience in listening to me. I hope this gives you a little bit more to think about when you're dealing with these important areas. Thank you.